Now that you've made a hypothesis, it's time to set up your experiment to put your predictions to the test and see what actually happens. We want you to make your clay caterpillars and place them on the 2 different plant species that you chose. Then you can come back in a few days or a week and see what happens to them and where birds attack them the most. When scientists set up experiments, they have to be very careful to make sure they aren't accidentally influencing the results one way or the other. We can do this with 3 important ideas called randomization, replication, and control. It will be up to you to make sure you're incorporating these ideas into the setup of your experiment. One of the ways we can protect against this impacting our data is through something called replication. With replication, we collect data many times, not just once. The more caterpillars we place on more individual plants, the better chance we have of seeing a real difference between the 2 species. In science, we usually try to have at least 10 replicates. In this case, that would mean 10 caterpillars on one plant species and 10 caterpillars on the other plant species. Ideally, if you can, you'll want these caterpillars to be spread out over several plants of each species. The next thing we always need to think about as scientists when we're setting up an experiment is randomization. Sometimes when you're setting up an experiment, you can affect your results without even knowing it. So for example, if I put all the caterpillars for one plant species on one side of the garden and all of the caterpillar species on the other side of the garden, there might be differences just from this one side of the garden to the next that would impact how the birds attack them. For example, maybe one side is sunnier than the other. Instead, try to find individuals of each plant type that you're comparing throughout your garden or throughout your school, and place your caterpillars on plants spaced more randomly throughout the area. The last thing to consider is control. These are the things we want to keep the same between all of our plants, so that the only thing that differs between them is the species and the adaptation. For example, you want to make sure that the clay caterpillars are about the same size, place the same number of caterpillars on each plant, and place them in the same way each time. So don't put all of the caterpillars up high on one species and down low on the other, because that could affect our results. So here's how I set up my experiment here at Crystal Cove. I have 20 clay caterpillars, and I want to compare how they get eaten on plants with small leaves versus plants with big leaves. So I have 2 individual buckwheat plants and 2 toyon plants in this area, so I'm going to put 5 caterpillars on each. You can spread your caterpillars out even more if you have more of each plant type in your garden. I placed the 5 caterpillars randomly on the plant, some down low, some up high, and the plants I have here are about the same size, and so are my caterpillars. Go ahead and move on to the next slide and work with your research team to write a plan in your science journal for how you will be setting up your experiment.